Right, we all know we get an accommodation sheet for our students at the start of a semester, and you're supposed to do certain things for your student, and sometimes your student wants you to, and sometimes they don't. But they might not be the best thing for the student, the accommodation that's required by law. All right, so for example, an example of an accommodation is to allow a student with physical or visual disabilities exemption from microscope work. So if they can't look in the microscope because of physical reasons or visual reasons, you can say, well, you don't have to do the microscope unit. That is a legal accommodation. But now, that student doesn't have the same information. They're not getting what everyone else is getting. And so is it really an appropriate accommodation for your course? Another thing is, some of the reasons that students don't do their accommodation is sometimes they can feel really singled out. So if you can do UDL in a way that so that includes all your students and doesn't necessarily single out somebody, that's terrific. UDL approaches enable you to teach the same material to all your students, and you want to keep thinking about that, or almost all your students. It's a broader group. So I'm going to show you the way that works for me to think about UDL and how to put it into my classroom. And I think it's easiest to pick apart different aspects of my class to look at how my class is set up. So I've got a worksheet for it that I've given you, and I did already tell you that another teacher liked those 3 approaches from the CAST website, and we can come back to that if you need to, the multiple means of representation, assessment, and engagement. For my purposes, I need really practical approaches. So instead of theoretical. So I've also come up with a worksheet only using some of the types of diversity, but you can think about all the others as well. And so it could be a much more complex worksheet, but I wanted to make it simple for a start. So if you take out the worksheet that looks like this, worksheet to redesign your course using UDL. When I said like the practical aspects of a course, I thought about, okay, what do students do? And this would be what the students do. What do I do? How I present? What's my content? That could be tricky. And then how do I do assessment? So the first thing to think about is what students do. And this could be in a lecture room or in a lab room. So there might be tasks or things that students do that require their physical movement or their dexterity. So that's just to think about what do they do, and if they have a physical disability or motor disability, how could they be limited, all right? Which tasks require visual observance? So think about all the things that your students do in the room, that if they don't see it, they can't do it. How about just listening or conversation? So now if there's somebody with an auditory processing problem or just an auditory disability in general, which things would they be limited in your class? And that could be a group work thing. Which tasks require a specific sequence of steps? So sometimes they have to do things, first do this, then do that, then do this, then do that, then do this, then do that. Now you have a student with a learning disability. They're like, what? What's next? What do I do next? So when you think about what you have going on in your class, what I'd like you to fill in on the line is when your students are doing all these things, think about your class. Which of these things could they not do? Another thing is that we often, when we think about what students have to do, we think, well, they should be able to do it. I'm not going to give them all this extra stuff because it's like holding their hand, you know? That's overkill. Some students can't proceed without it, though. I think everybody would do better with it in general anyway, so you can give it to them and not worry that you're really force feeding. So this is for what they do. So just take a second and think about anything in your class that your students do, whether it's all of a specific sequence of steps they have to run through, or if they have to do something that's really just listening, like not with their hands or anything, if they have to do something that they have to see, okay, if they can't see it, they can't do it. And this isn't even just for students specifically with a visual disability. You know, you get that student who really wants to sit in the back, but when they're in the back, they can't see. What does that say? What'd you just write? Well, it's this big. You know, it's like 3 inches tall on the board. You should be able to see it. But they want to sit in the back, but they can't see the board if they sit in the back. Now think about what you do. Okay, do you mostly just draw on the board? So if you have a board, do you use it all the time? Do you mostly just talk? That's what I'm doing today. Do you move around? Do you have students move around? Like, is it moving around a big part of your class? Do you have students working in groups? Do you give applications for your material? Now, sometimes in anatomy and physiology, for example, an application seems easy because you've got this health application that they can understand someone's sick or they've got a disease or whatever it is. But sometimes it's not so easy to understand, and even when it is a disease, sometimes it's hard for students. So I want you to think about applications. Now, another thing about this is it might seem like it'd be really easy because if you want to change any of these, but it's really the hardest thing because we get into a rut. We have our classroom a certain way. We have a certain style. We do it every day. Every time you change what you do, it's hard. So this is really, I think, the hardest thing to change in your classroom is to change what you do. Now, as far as moving around, I had a student, not this past fall, but the fall before, who had PTSD from, he was a veteran. And he needed to sit in a spot in the room where he could see all the exits. And if I walked over to him, he warned me. He said, don't just surprise me. Don't just like walk over. And a couple times I'm starting to walk over and I would make sure that he could hear my voice so he knew I was coming. Because I didn't want that. I didn't want to see what he would do when he was surprised. Because he was tough, okay? So you don't want to surprise him. And moving around really freaked him out. Which topics are really complicated? So there's all these levels. It's tiered. It's hierarchical. Okay, multi-level. There are some concepts that are strictly visual, especially in biology or in sciences and in math too. There can be things that just seem really visual. There's also, sometimes you give your students information from a whole bunch of sources. And if you give them a picture of the same thing from here and there and here and there and here and there, some people love it and some people, it overwhelms them, okay? Also, there's some information that has multiple thought steps. So if you can guide them through questions that are open-ended still, but help them focus, then they'll probably succeed. But it's new for them, all this material. So without the guidance, some students can't get there. You have to consider a variety of variables and which variables are at work in which situation, and based on which variables are there, you get a certain outcome. So for assessments, do you have multiple methods for student expression? There are a lot of different assessment strategies to make an assessment more UDL, and I'll give you some things that I've done, but you kind of know if you have a student that just can't do certain things, and you can give them multiple opportunities. Like I will give them a take-home, and the take-home, yeah, they can use their book. Yeah, they can talk to each other. I don't mind, because what are they doing? They're working on the material. I want you to use the worksheet and choose 1 or 2 areas that stand out as target areas for redesign. So anything that could be problematic for certain students that you either do, they do, your content, or maybe your assessment. And just start to list what the key ideas are or goals of each of these target areas are. So what I put on here is that sometimes we're so used to doing something one way that we don't consider other ways. And to do that, we have to more fully define the goals of that lesson.